In a small town nestled along the Mississippi River, James Carter grew up in days filled with summer sun and biting winter cold. His family lived in an old wooden house where his father's guitar strummed every evening and the smell of his mother's cornbread filled the kitchen. But everything changed one fateful day when James turned 20. A devastating tornado swept through the town, destroying the home his family had spent a lifetime building. Standing amid the rubble, James felt his heart sink, wondering if life still held any meaning. One rainy afternoon, as James huddled under the makeshift awning of a temporary shed, he heard soft footsteps approaching. It was Ruth, an elderly woman the townsfolk called the Lady of Hope. She was well over 80, her silver hair gleaming like snow, but her eyes shone with an uncommon vitality. Sitting beside him, she placed a wrinkled hand on his shoulder without saying much. "Do you believe this tornado isn't the end, James?" Ruth asked, her voice warm and steady. James looked at her, his eyes clouded with doubt. "Believe? Believe in what, when everything I had is gone?" Ruth smiled, a gentle smile like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. "Faith isn't something you see with your eyes, James. It's a lantern burning in your heart, lighting the way even when darkness is thickest. You know, faith is like an anchor keeping a boat steady in a storm. And the greatest anchor we can cling to is God." James fell silent. He'd never thought much about God. His family went to church on holidays, but to him, it was just a routine, not something profound. Yet Ruth's words echoed in his mind, "Faith is a lantern burning in your heart." Could such a thing really exist? And if it did, how could he find it amid the wreckage of his life? In the days that followed, James began noticing how Ruth lived. Despite her age, she walked to church every morning, carrying a worn-out Bible with frayed edges. She didn't just pray for herself, she prayed for the whole town, from hungry children to despairing adults. James watched her share her meager scraps of bread with the homeless, and he wondered, what makes her so strong? One evening, as he sat by a small fire to warm himself, James asked her, "Ruth, does faith really change anything? I want to believe, but I don't know where to start." Ruth looked at him, her gaze tender yet firm. "Faith isn't a magic trick that puts everything back the way it was, James. It's the strength to stand up, keep going, and find meaning even in suffering. Trusting in God doesn't mean believing He'll give you everything you want, it means believing He's with you, even when you can't see Him." James nodded, though doubt lingered in his heart. But from that moment, a tiny seed was planted in his soul, the seed of faith. Little did he know, the journey to find that light would lead him through great trials, strange dreams, and discoveries about himself. In the days after his talk with Ruth, James felt a subtle shift inside him, though he couldn't quite name it. Yet the shadow of fear still clung to him like the chill seeping through his thin coat. Each night, lying on an old blanket in the shed, he'd hear the wind whistling through the cracks, a haunting reminder of the tornado. He feared life would remain a string of uncertainties, that he'd never reclaim peace. One Sunday morning, James decided to follow Ruth to church, not because he suddenly believed, but because he was curious about what kept her so calm. The little wooden church at the edge of town, its white paint peeling, glowed warmly inside with flickering candles and the voices of a few survivors singing hymns. Ruth sat in the front pew, her Bible in hand, a faint smile on her lips as the pastor began his sermon. That day, the pastor read from Psalm 23:4, "Yeah, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me." James listened, but the words made him frown. Fear no evil? How can you not fear when everything could collapse again at any moment, he thought. After the service, Ruth called him over, as if sensing his unspoken question. She handed him her old Bible and said, "Read Joshua 1:9 and tell me what you think." James opened the page and read aloud, "Have not I commanded thee? Be strong and of a good courage, be not afraid, neither be thou dismayed, for the Lord thy God is with thee whithersoever thou goest." He hesitated. "But how can I be strong when I've got nothing left to hold onto, Ruth?" Ruth gazed out through the church window at the Mississippi flowing quietly by. "Faith doesn't erase fear, James. It helps you face it. When you believe God is with you, even in the darkest valley, you'll see fear isn't your master anymore. It's just a shadow, and shadows can't hurt you. Her words lingered in James's mind. That night, alone in the shed, he opened the Bible Ruth had given him. He read Psalm 27:1, "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the strength of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid?" For the first time, a warmth crept into his chest, not because his troubles vanished, but because he began to imagine a greater strength beside him. The next day, a sudden downpour flooded the road into town. James saw neighbors panicking, afraid the water would seep into their makeshift shelters. He started to turn away, but then recalled Ruth's words, "Be not afraid, for the Lord thy God is with thee." Taking a deep breath, he stepped into the rain and began helping people move their belongings to higher ground. His hands trembled, his heart raced, but he didn't stop. For the first time, he felt fear didn't fully control him. When the rain cleared, a neighbor clapped him on the shoulder. "You surprised me, kid. I thought you'd be scared like the rest of us." James gave a small smile. "I was. But maybe I'm learning not to let fear call the shots." That night, as he lay down to rest, James closed his eyes and whispered, "God, if you're really here, help me be stronger." He didn't hear a reply, but a peaceful sleep came over him, something he hadn't known since the tornado struck. After that first night of prayer, James began to feel a newfound calm, though life around him remained tough. The town still struggled to recover from the tornado, and endless rain didn't help. Strangely, though, whenever he closed his eyes at night, vivid dreams started to appear so clear they jolted him awake. One night, James dreamed he stood on a dusty road under a blazing sun. Around him were homeless people, their clothes tattered, clutching worn-out bags. A thin man with sunburned skin sat under a barren tree, his sunken eyes gleaming with intensity. He looked at James and said, "Give them water, for they thirst." James glanced around. No river, no well, but he stepped forward, reaching out as if he could help. Suddenly, his hands held a large jug of water, and as he poured, it never ran dry. The homeless smiled, thanked him, and walked away with peaceful faces. When James turned back to the man under the tree, he was gone, leaving only a strange warmth in James's heart. James awoke, sweat beading on his forehead, but not from fear. He was puzzled. What did it mean? Why would he, a man with nothing but empty hands, dream of helping others? The next morning, he shared the dream with Ruth as they sat by the river, where she often read her Bible. She listened intently, then smiled. "Do you know the story of Jesus and the Samaritan woman at the well?" she asked. James shook his head. Ruth opened her Bible to John 4:13-14 and read, "Whosoever drinketh of this water shall thirst again, but whosoever drinketh of the water that I shall give him shall never thirst, but the water that I shall give him shall be in him a well of water springing up into everlasting life." She paused, looking at James. "Your dream wasn't random. Jesus spoke of living water not just to drink, but love, hope, and salvation. Maybe he's calling you to do something." "But how can I, Ruth?" James protested. "I don't even have a decent place to sleep. Where would I get water to give anyone?" Ruth rested a hand on his shoulder. "The water in your dream isn't something you hold with your hands, James. It's compassion, the care you can share. Remember how Jesus fed 5,000? He used a boy's few loaves and fish, and that was enough for a miracle. He doesn't need you to have much, he just needs you to be willing." Her words sank in. James thought of the homeless people he'd seen around town, folks like him who'd lost homes, but worse off, with no one by their side. He recalled the dream, the endless jug, and wondered if he could do something, even something small. That afternoon, James took action. With the little money he had left, he bought some bread and bottled water from the only store still open in town. He went to the vacant lot near the bridge where a few homeless people camped. Without saying much, he handed out the food and water, then sat to talk. An older man with matted hair looked at him and said, "You didn't have to do this. You're struggling like us. James smiled faintly. I think sometimes sharing is how we get through together. That night, back in the shed, James dreamed again. This time, the man under the tree smiled at him, his voice echoing, "Well done, you begun." Waking up, James felt a peace he'd never known. The dream wasn't just a vision, it was a reminder that his faith was growing, step by step. After the second dream, James felt a small fire smoldering in his heart, not a raging blaze, but a gentle, persistent nudge. He realized faith wasn't just a comforting feeling, it was action, a way of living each day. But how could he live like Jesus, someone he only knew through distant Bible stories? He turned to Ruth, who had become his guiding light. One early morning, as mist blanketed the river, James found Ruth sitting on an old wooden chair outside the church. He hesitated. "Ruth, I want to live like Jesus, but I don't know how to start. He was the Savior, I'm just a guy with nothing but empty hands." Ruth chuckled, her eyes twinkling like the river catching the first rays of dawn. "Jesus didn't start with gold or power, James. He started with love and compassion. Do you remember when he washed his disciples' feet? That's in John 13. He, the greatest of all, stooped to serve the lowliest. Living like him isn't about grand deeds, it's about small acts with a willing heart." James nodded, though still unsure. "But what can I do? I don't have much to give." "You don't need much," Ruth replied. Jesus said in Matthew 25:40, "Verily I say unto you, inasmuch as ye have done it unto one of the least of these my brethren, ye have done it unto me." Look for those who need help around you and start there. Serving isn't about giving riches, it's about giving yourself. Her words lit up James's mind. He thought of the homeless folks he'd fed, their grateful eyes when he handed them bread. He realized that, even without a home or money, he had time, strength, and a heart learning to open. That day, James took his first steps. He returned to the lot near the bridge, this time bringing a bucket and some scrap wood he'd salvaged from the town's ruins. With Sam, the man who'd thanked him before, James began building a simple shelter to shield against rain. His hands ached from the rough wood, but when it was done, Sam's smile made him forget the pain. "Nobody's done this for us," Sam said, his voice rough. "You remind me of those stories about Jesus my mom used to tell." James was taken aback. "I'm just trying to learn from him. I'm not great at it, but I want to try." From then on, James sought out chances to serve. He helped a single mother nearby fix a door the wind had torn loose, borrowing tools from a neighbor. He sat listening to an old man ramble about the past, though the man had nothing to offer but a grateful nod. Each small act brought James closer to Jesus, not because he became perfect, but because he was learning to love like him. One evening, sitting by the river with Ruth, James admitted, "I'm still not sure I'm doing it right, but I feel different. Like I'm not just living for myself anymore." Ruth nodded, pressing the Bible into his hands. "That's what Jesus wanted, James. He didn't call us to hold on to things, but to give them away. You're on the right path." That night, as moonlight danced on the Mississippi, James felt a new strength in his heart. He knew this journey was just beginning, but he was ready to keep walking one small step at a time, following the one he was learning to love. As the days passed, James grew accustomed to walking in faith through small, meaningful acts. He no longer felt like just a victim of the tornado, he was part of something greater. Yet gaps remained in his heart, unanswered questions, lingering fears about the future he couldn't shake. He wanted to be closer to God, but didn't know how to breach that invisible wall. One afternoon, while helping Sam patch up the shelter near the bridge, James heard Ruth humming an old hymn from a distance. Her voice trembled with age but brimmed with life. "Nearer, my God, to thee, nearer to thee." James paused, listening, feeling an odd pull. He turned to Ruth as she approached. "Ruth, how do I get closer to God? I've tried helping others, but sometimes he still feels so far away." Ruth sat on a nearby rock, smoothing her wind-tossed silver hair. "Have you ever prayed with your whole heart, James?" she asked. James faltered. "I've said a few words before bed, but I'm not sure he hears." What's prayer, Ruth? Just talking to the air. Ruth smiled, pulling her worn Bible from an old cloth bag. She opened to Philippians 4:6-7 and read, "Be careful for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving let your requests be made known unto God. And the peace of God, which passeth all understanding, shall keep your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus." She paused, meeting James's eyes. Prayer isn't a ritual, it's opening your heart to God, like talking to a father or friend. When you pray, you invite him into your life. James nodded, still unsure. "But what do I say? I'm not good with words." "You don't have to be," Ruth said. Jesus taught in Matthew 6:7 that prayer doesn't need to be long or fancy. Just be honest. Tell him what you think, what you fear, what you hope. He hears it all, even if you don't see the answer right away. That night, James decided to try. Sitting in the shed under the faint glow of a candle, he closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and whispered, "God, I don't know if you're really there. I'm scared of the future, scared everything will fall apart again. But I want to trust you, to feel you. Please help me." The words were clumsy, halting, but as they spilled out, an unseen weight lifted from his shoulders. He heard no reply, but a strange peace settled in like the peace Ruth had read about. From then on, James prayed daily. Some days he thanked God for the food he found, others he asked for strength to help people, and sometimes he just sat quietly, listening to the wind over the fields. Prayer didn't stop the rain or bring back his old house, but it changed him. Each prayer became a thread tying him to God, growing stronger with time. One morning, praying by the river, James heard a faint sob. He stood and saw a girl, about 5, soaked and shivering under a tree. She'd lost her mother in the rain the night before. James brought her to the shelters, praying silently, "God, help me find her mom." Soon after, he spotted a frantic woman running toward them, the girl's mother. As they embraced, sobbing, the woman grabbed James's hand. "Thank you. I prayed someone would find her." James smiled, a sense of wonder filling him. Prayer wasn't just strengthening his faith, it was how God used him to answer others' prayers. That night, closing his eyes, he murmured, "God, thank you for hearing me." And for the first time, he slept knowing he wasn't alone. As the cold winter days gave way, James noticed the town changing, not because houses were rebuilt or roads repaired, but because people were opening up to each other. His small axe building shelters, finding the lost girl, rippled outward like waves on the Mississippi. Around evening fires to keep warm, folks began sharing their own stories of faith, loss, and hope. One night, as the fire crackled, Sam, the homeless man James had helped, spoke up. His voice was rough but alive. "I've never told anyone this, but I had a family once. A flood took them, my wife, my kid, and my faith in God. I wandered, thinking life was over. But when you, James, brought bread and sat with me, I remembered a verse my mom loved, 'The Lord is nigh unto them that are of a broken heart,' Psalm 34:18. You made me think maybe he hasn't given up on me." James listened, moved. He hadn't realized his small gesture had touched such a deep wound in Sam. "I used to think God was far off too," he said. "But now I see him in little things like us talking here." Then Ruth spoke. She sat straight, firelight dancing in her bright eyes. "I lost my husband and son in an accident 30 years ago," she said. "I was so angry at God, asking why he left me alone. But one night, crying myself dry, I heard a voice in my heart, 'My grace is sufficient for thee,' like in 2 Corinthians 12:9. Since then, I've lived to help others, like Jesus did." "James, you're an answer to my prayers," a young man bringing hope here. James bowed his head, choked up. He'd never thought of himself as anyone's answer. Ruth's story showed him faith didn't just change him, it spread to those around him. Mary, the mother whose daughter James had saved, spoke next. "I was never big on church," she said, cradling her sleeping girl. "But the night she got lost, I prayed for the first time in years. I begged God to send someone, and then you showed up, James. I don't know if it's a miracle, but I'm starting to believe he cares." The story struck James deeply. Faith wasn't fixed or flawless, it was a journey, often full of doubt, but strengthened by moments of connection. He decided to share his own. "I thought my life ended when the tornado hit," James said slowly. "But thanks to Ruth, the dreams, and all of you, I've learned faith isn't about having everything, it's about trusting I'm not alone. I started praying, helping others, and each time, I feel God a little closer." As the group dispersed that night, James lingered by the fire with Ruth. "Do you think faith can change this whole town?" he asked. Ruth's eyes gleamed with confidence. "It's already starting, James. Through you, Sam, Mary. Faith is like this fire, just a spark can warm a cold night." Back in the shed, James closed his eyes and prayed, "God, thank you for these people. Use me to bring hope, like you've used them to change me." He drifted off, feeling part of something vast, a community bound by faith. The days after that fireside sharing left James lighter than ever. He'd found purpose in helping others, in prayer, and in the community stories. But life wasn't always a smooth road, and soon, trials emerged, testing the small flame of faith he'd kindled. One morning, as James helped Sam reinforce the shelter near the bridge, a group of strangers arrived. They were drifters from another town, drawn by tales of James's generosity, seeking food and shelter. But they didn't come with gratitude, they demanded, argued, and even stole the few supplies James and Sam had gathered. When James tried to intervene, a tall man snapped at him, "Who do you think you are, acting all holy? Don't preach to me." The words hit James like a punch. He stood frozen, fists clenched, anger and disappointment swirling inside. He'd tried to help, and this was his reward. After the group left, leaving chaos behind, James sank to the ground, wondering if his efforts were worth it. That night, he sought Ruth, his heart heavy. "Ruth, I don't think I can keep going. I want to live like Jesus, but why is it so hard? I helped them, and they hurt me. What good is faith when things just get worse?" Ruth met his gaze, gentle but unwavering. "James, do you remember how Jesus was rejected? In John 6, after feeding 5,000, the crowd turned away when he didn't give them what they wanted. Faith doesn't promise an easy path. It promises God will be with you through the hard parts." James shook his head. "But I'm tired, Ruth. I don't know how to go on." Ruth opened her Bible to James 1:2-3 and read, "My brethren, count it all joy when ye fall into divers temptations, knowing this, that the trying of your faith worketh patience." She paused, resting a hand on his shoulder. "Trials are the wind blowing through your faith's flame. It can snuff it out or make it burn brighter depending on how you face it." Her words gave James pause, but the trials didn't stop. Days later, a sudden downpour swept through, washing away the shelter he and Sam had built. Sam, who'd started trusting James, looked at him with disappointment. "I thought you said God was with us. Why'd he let this happen?" Sam's question cut deep. James wanted to answer, but he didn't know what to say. His faith wavered, a candle flickering in the wind. That night, he didn't pray the first time in weeks. Lying in the shed, staring at the damp ceiling, he wondered if it was all an illusion. But the next morning, as the first sunlight broke through the clouds, a knock came at the door. It was Mary, carrying some planks and nails. "I heard the shelter got washed away," she said. "I don't have much, but I want to help you rebuild. You've done so much for us." Then Sam appeared, holding an old hammer. "Sorry I blamed you," he said sheepishly. "I think you're right, we can't give up." Seeing them, James felt a surge of strength. He recalled Ruth's words, "The trying of your faith worketh patience." Kneeling in the shed, he whispered, "God, I'm sorry for doubting. Give me strength to keep going." Standing, he smiled at Mary and Sam. "Thanks, you two. Let's rebuild together." That day, they remade the shelter not just for the homeless, but for James's faith. He realized trials weren't the end, but chances to trust God deeper and lean on the community he'd placed around him. Spring finally arrived at the little Mississippi town, bringing warm breezes and green hues to the fields. James stood by the river, gazing at the simple shelters he, Sam, Mary, and others had rebuilt after the rain. They weren't grand or sturdy like the old homes, but they stood for something greater: resilience, love, and faith. James's journey began in the tornado's wreckage, where he'd thought his life was over. Looking back, each step taught him something precious. He remembered Ruth's words, "Faith is a lighthouse in the storm." It guided him through fear, as Psalm 23 showed God was with him in the darkest valleys. Dreams of aiding the homeless taught him Jesus' love needed only a willing heart, like the miracle of 5 loaves and 2 fish. James learned to live like Christ through small acts, building shelters, fixing doors, listening to those in need. Serving wasn't about giving wealth, but giving himself, as Jesus washed his disciples' feet. Prayer became his lifeline to God, bringing peace beyond understanding, as Philippians promised. Through Sam, Mary, and Ruth's stories, he saw faith didn't just change him, it spread like a fire, warming the community. Trials came too: rejection from strangers, rain washing away his work. He doubted, wanted to quit. But in those moments, he learned faith wasn't perfection, but patience and trust. James 1 was right: trials bred endurance, leading to stronger faith. One afternoon, sitting with Ruth by the river, the old Bible between them, James said, "Ruth, I used to think faith was something big, not for someone like me. Now I see it's small steps, day by day." Ruth smiled, her eyes bright as the day they'd met. "That's right, James. The journey of faith isn't a destination, it's the path you walk with God. You've started, and that's what matters most." That night, James stood before his small community: Sam, Mary, her little girl, and a few others. Holding a candle lit from the fire, he said, "Thank you all for being with me. I can't promise a perfect life, but I promise to keep walking with faith, prayer, and all I've got. I hope you will too." The candle flickered in James's hand, small but steady, like the faith in his heart. He knew the journey wasn't over. More trials, dreams, and chances to live like Jesus lay ahead. But he wasn't afraid. The Mississippi flowed on, calm and constant, a reminder that God was there, guiding him each day. As moonlight shimmered on the water, James whispered, "God, thank you for this journey. Lead me on." And he smiled, ready for what lay ahead.